Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little chewy. Something that smells faintly of oats, mold, and occasionally bad decisions. I want you to dim the lights, get comfy, maybe even pull a blanket over your shoulders, because we are about to drift slowly through the world's weirdest historical diets. And when I say weird, I mean the sort of food choices that would make your modern taste buds file a formal complaint. Not because anyone was trying to be cruel or eccentric, though sometimes they were, but because this was what people had, and they made it work. Somehow. Let's start in the Middle Ages, a time when being alive was already a full-time job, and eating was often just a way to fill your stomach without dying. Royalty didn't get off easy either. Sure, they had banquets and gold goblets and endless platters of stuff that sounds fancy to us now, like swan or peacock, or even dormice. Yes, literally roasted dormice, which was apparently considered a delicacy. But even kings and queens had to contend with the practicalities of storing food in a pre-refrigeration era. Spoilage was a constant companion, so sometimes they just ate whatever didn't smell too bad. One of the most common staples was gruel, which is basically hot water with oats, barley, or some other grain floating in it like tiny, soggy boats. Everyone ate it. Peasants, nobles, monks, even children. It was bland, it was mushy, and it did exactly what food should do, keep you alive. Sometimes they added a bit of milk or honey if they were feeling fancy, though fancy here is relative. Imagine a 10th century noble calling their breakfast delectable while silently wishing for cinnamon. But cinnamon was a luxury, and if you were poor, you were just hoping your gruel didn't curdle before noon. Let's float over to the Victorian era, where food etiquette was a kind of performance art. They loved their jellies and blancmanges, wobbly, opaque concoctions made from boiled bones and sugar. Yes, sugar was expensive, so even for the well-off, these gelatinous desserts were a treat, a conversation piece, and something to nervously poke with a fork while trying not to dribble it on your lace cuffs. Of course, some recipes were more ambitious, like layering chicken, fish, and aspic in a single loaf to create what they optimistically called a savory jelly terrine. And yes, people ate this, and yes, they considered it sophisticated. You do you, Victorian England. Meanwhile, in ancient Rome, citizens of a certain social class had a completely different approach. They prized fermented fish sauce, or garum, which was made by literally letting fish guts sit in the sun until they liquefied into a pungent, amber-colored paste. It was added to almost everything: meat, vegetables, bread, even desserts if you were particularly ambitious or desperate. Garum was apparently so beloved that some Roman gourmets would pay the equivalent of a month's wages for a single jar. Imagine spending all your denarii on a bottle of rotting fish juice. Of course, people did it, and they raved about it. History's full of luxury items that modern humans would happily reject. Across Europe in the same general time frame, bread was a bit of a social statement, depending on who was eating it. The poor got coarse, gritty loaves filled with bran, bits of chaff, and sometimes mysterious seeds. It was nutritious in a sad survivalist sort of way. The wealthy, on the other hand, enjoyed fine white bread, bleached and soft, sometimes served in shapes resembling crowns or animals. But if you were unlucky, even fine bread could harbor mold or weevils because cleanliness standards were flexible. It wasn't uncommon to find someone carefully picking out insects from a loaf and then eating the rest. Hey, protein is protein. Speaking of protein, let's talk about the curious case of peasant diets versus elite diets. For peasants, meat was often a treat reserved for market days or festivals. Mostly they ate pottage, which is a slow-cooked stew of vegetables, grains, and sometimes scraps of meat or offal. Offal, for those unfamiliar, is the internal organs: liver, kidneys, brains, sometimes lungs. This was considered nutritious and also use what you got. If you were noble, though, offal might show up on your plate in a more ceremonial context: sweetbreads wrapped in gold leaf, liver delicately poached and served with syrup, hearts roasted and presented as gifts at court. Because why not double down on the organ theme? Let's drift to the Renaissance, where culinary experimentation became an art form. People started using exotic spices not just for flavor, but as status symbols. Saffron, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, sprinkle liberally, because nothing says I have too much money like a stew that costs more than a small farm. Some recipes were so convoluted that cooks needed entire notebooks of instructions, carefully noting that you must soak a chicken in rose water, coat it in sugar, roast it until golden, then cover it with almonds and brandy. Eating was a multi-step performance, like a slow dance, and you could barely whisper while doing it for fear of ruining the timing. Meanwhile, in Asia, particularly China, the upper classes had their own fascinating quirks. For instance, bird's nest soup, made from the saliva nests of certain swiftlets, was prized for supposed health benefits. And yes, people spent hours collecting, cleaning, and boiling what is essentially hardened bird spit. Imagine sitting down at dinner and carefully sipping a translucent gelatinous blob you're told will make your skin radiant. History is full of small indignities served with the promise of wellness. Let's glide gently to the topic of preserved foods, which comes up again and again across time and place. Without refrigeration, people had to rely on salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, or burying things in sand or ash. Fish, meat, even vegetables could end up tasting like a slightly sad science experiment. Some of the most delicious preserved foods were accidentally discovered, like cheeses with mold growing exactly where it shouldn't, or pickled vegetables that turned into something resembling a leather shoe. And yet, people ate them anyway, because options were limited, and hunger tends to make you tolerant of odd textures. Now, you might be thinking, surely there's some fun food history left. And there is, but mostly it's quietly strange rather than exciting. For example, in the Middle Ages, sugar was sometimes mixed into meat dishes. Sweet stews, candied pork, and honey-glazed chicken were not uncommon. The combination sounds bizarre now, but it was considered utterly normal, and yes, people genuinely enjoyed it. The elite might also experiment with rosewater, violets, or saffron in sauces, creating flavors we can only describe today as florally confusing. And then there's the matter of drinks, which historically were just as odd. Ale, mead, and wine were staples because water was unreliable. In some areas, beer was weaker than we'd expect, brewed to avoid poisoning, but low in alcohol so children and adults could drink it daily. Wine might be mixed with water, honey, or spices. In the 17th century, it was common to flavor beer with herbs like wormwood or even ground pepper. So while people thought they were being sophisticated, they were essentially sipping mildly spiced mud water with friends. Social, yes. Relaxing, definitely. Let's not forget desserts, which were often less about taste and more about presentation or health. Marzipan, for instance, made from almonds and sugar, could be molded into fruits, animals, or mythical beasts. Eating it wasn't so much a pleasure as a polite duty during a banquet. Similarly, custards, jellies, and rice puddings were slow-cooked, bland, and entirely suitable for slowly nodding off while a servant placed them in front of you. Before we wrap this section, let's drift briefly into the realm of survival foods, which are less glamorous. During famines, sieges, or long winters, people resorted to bark, roots, boiled grasses, or even rats and insects. Not everyone survived in style, and sometimes clever culinary improvisation led to strangely preserved combinations, like bread made with chalk or milk substitutes derived from cereals. Eating was often about making it to the next meal rather than enjoyment. So, what do we take from all this? Basically, historical diets were messy, bland, occasionally pungent, and often entirely dictated by circumstance. Royals had interestingly odd tastes, elites experimented with flavors to show off wealth, and ordinary people mostly tried to survive without getting sick. Across time and place, humans were creative, resilient, and occasionally foolish about what they decided was good to eat. And that, friends, is enough to gently fill our minds as we drift closer to sleep.
In the next part, we'll float over to some of the world's strangest historical delicacies, including things like fermented shark, bird embryos, and other edible oddities that were somehow considered desirable. But for now, you can let the image of slow-cooked gruel, sweetened meats, and slightly suspicious ale fill your mind as you settle in. All right, so we've settled into the comforting mush of gruels and bland breads, but now let's float gently over to some of the stranger delicacies that history offers. By strange, I mean things that your modern palate will politely suggest you reconsider, but people back then thought were perfectly acceptable, sometimes even luxurious. Let's begin in medieval Scandinavia, where fermented shark, hockerel, was considered a treat. Now picture this. A fisherman catches a shark, buries it in the ground for several months, lets it rot to a very precise degree, and then hangs it to dry. It's pungent, it's chewy, and yes, it smells something like ammonia and sea air, which in fairness is quite authentic. Vikings naturally loved it. They considered it nutritious and brave to eat because surviving the smell was apparently a measure of one's courage or social standing. You could imagine a young Viking trying to impress someone across the longhouse, slowly chewing the fermented meat and nodding gravely while internally regretting life choices. Moving slightly south, in Imperial China, we find bird embryos served in soy sauce or tea-infused broth. Balut, a delicacy that still exists today in some regions, was seen as nourishing and exotic. People would sip the broth slowly, savoring both the flavor and the social ritual of consuming something that, in another context, might be considered questionable. The texture was soft, the flavor subtle, and the experience highly performative. Dinner conversation revolved more around the proper etiquette of consumption than actual taste. Back in Europe, the elite had their own peculiarities. Let's gently consider swan, peacock, and dormice again, but this time in full ceremonial detail. Swans were roasted whole and presented with feathers replaced in gold leaf, purely for effect. Peacock, interestingly, was sometimes served with its feathers reattached after cooking, because what says refined more than edible taxidermy? And dormice, often stuffed with minced meat and roasted, were not considered pet rats, but a delicacy. One can imagine nobles politely nibbling, trying to appear unbothered by the tiny squeak of their culinary subjects.
Meanwhile, in medieval England, pies became a canvas for experimentation. Not the sweet kind you'd imagine. No, these pies could contain meat, fruit, and spices in equal measure, often to disguise the smell of meat that was no longer entirely fresh. Bakers might throw in anything from apples to pork to offal, hoping that a pinch of cinnamon would convince diners that this was a sophisticated edible artwork rather than a practical survival tool. Children might peek at these pies, slightly horrified, while adults nodded with appreciation, or at least tried not to vomit. Let's drift now to Renaissance France, where sugar was expensive and desserts were both a show of wealth and a culinary challenge. Consider savory sweetbreads, often incorporating saffron, almonds, and rosewater, layered atop meat or fish. Imagine slicing a loaf of chicken and finding a subtle perfume of flowers and nuts in the flesh. It sounds a bit like a science experiment gone mildly wrong, and yet contemporaries adored it. We can gently imagine a French noble sipping wine, poking at their meal and murmuring polite approval, while secretly thinking, "What on earth?" If we float eastward, Japan and Korea offered fermented delicacies that were similarly challenging to modern sensibilities. Pickled plums, salted fish, and miso-based dishes formed the foundation of everyday meals. Fermentation, in this context, was not only a preservation method, but also a subtle flavor enhancement. People consumed these items slowly, often with rice or noodles, quietly appreciating the nourishment without drama. There is a calming, repetitive rhythm to this kind of eating. Chew, swallow, sip, repeat, which is precisely why it's ideal for a sleep-oriented historical journey. In Victorian Europe, we find desserts and sweets that were elaborate, time-consuming, and occasionally alarming. Consider blancmange, a gelatinous concoction of milk, sugar, and sometimes almond flavoring, molded into animal shapes or decorative forms. Eating it required concentration because collapsing a sculpted jelly in front of guests was considered extremely bad form. Similarly, custards and puddings were carefully poured, baked, and cooled to perfection, often in ornate ramekins. Victorian cooks invested hours into preparation, while diners invested mental energy into slow, polite consumption. It's easy to imagine a sleepy noble staring at their bowl, lifting the spoon and nodding rhythmically as they drifted through their meal. Meanwhile, the humble peasant persisted with much simpler fare. Roots, porridge, and seasonal vegetables formed the bulk of their diets. Potatoes, turnips, cabbages, and grains, often boiled together for hours, offered sustenance without flair. Occasionally, they added a small piece of salted meat, but mostly their meals were unremarkable, functional, and repetitive. This is perhaps the most sleep-friendly diet of all, predictable, nourishing, and unambitious. Chew slowly, swallow, nod, repeat. Let's pause briefly to consider the issue of spices. Across history, exotic spices were rare and costly, and thus mostly a luxury for elites. Pepper, saffron, nutmeg, cloves, each of these arrived via perilous trade routes and immediately became a status symbol. Adding pepper to a stew or sprinkling saffron on rice wasn't primarily about taste. It was a subtle announcement. I have enough money to ship aromatic plant matter across continents, and I'm clever enough to cook with it. The irony is that many of these spices are very strong in flavor, yet people's primary aim was showing off wealth rather than culinary pleasure. Floating gently to Eastern Europe, we see the practical use of fermentation in everyday foods. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and sourdough breads kept communities alive through long winters. These foods were not glamorous, but they were reliable. Fermented fish pastes and cheeses were sometimes introduced at courtly tables, just to prove sophistication. Diners would politely nibble and then quietly sip wine to mask the strongest flavors. The ritual, rather than the taste itself, was the point. Now let's drift to the bizarre intersection of medicine and diet. In early modern Europe, food was often prescribed to treat ailments. Sickly children might be fed gruel enriched with wine or spices. Adults with vague stomach complaints were told to eat things like gold leaf, marrow, and honeyed meat to balance humors. The meals were slow, careful, and often tasteless, but highly ritualized. One imagines a fatigued patient quietly chewing, wishing for something normal, while a physician observes with grave approval. Lastly, for this section, let's consider the preservation of protein in pre-modern societies. Salted meats, dried fish, and cured hams were critical for survival. The processes were meticulous. Meat had to be salted for days, stored properly, and checked for spoilage. And yes, sometimes people got it wrong. Fermented or slightly off meat became part of daily life out of necessity. It was mundane, slightly worrying, but familiar, much like the rhythmic sounds of a distant river, quietly constant.
So, in summary, our journey through weird historical foods reveals something very human. Across continents and centuries, people ate strange things for reasons that make sense only in context. Survival, wealth display, ritual, or experimentation. Their meals were sometimes pungent, sometimes bland, occasionally alarming, and always reflective of their time. And now we can let these images, fermented shark, gilded swan, bird embryos, wobbly blancmange, fade gently into the background as we prepare to float even further into the sleepy, edible oddities of history in the next section. All right, let's drift a little further into the realm of culinary oddities that somehow survived centuries. By now, you're probably feeling comfortably warm, maybe a little drowsy, and ready to float gently alongside these historical eating habits. So we'll continue slowly, thoughtfully, and with the quiet irony that history seems to demand. Let's start with something that might make you silently nod in sympathy: roasted dormice. Yes, again, because they bear repeating. These small rodents were stuffed with meat, herbs, or sometimes nuts, skewered or baked in clay, and served as snacks or delicacies in ancient Rome. For wealthy Romans, dormice weren't a desperate protein source. They were a carefully curated treat. Some families even bred them in special containers called gliraria, essentially little dormouse nurseries. It's a bit like raising pets to eventually eat them, but, historically fashionable. Imagine quietly nibbling one while someone explains that this is the height of sophistication, and trying not to think about its previous squeaks. That's history for you. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, meats and game were often presented as spectacles rather than sustenance. Peacocks, swans, and geese could appear at banquets with their feathers reattached, gilded if necessary, because nothing says "I am wealthy and cultured" like serving an almost lifelike, edible bird centerpiece. There was a slow, deliberate theatricality to meals. Cut a slice here, poke at a jelly there, nod politely, sip wine to soften any unexpected odors. It's a calming, repetitive rhythm, really, the perfect pacing for sleepy minds. Let's pause to consider fruits and vegetables, which were sometimes surprisingly boring and sometimes surprisingly weird. Early Europeans ate pears, apples, and plums, which were generally fine. But some varieties were intentionally sour, a bit bitter, or mealy, because preservation was easier with slightly unripe fruits. Vegetables could be pickled, boiled, or mashed into gruels, offering little in taste, but a gentle warmth and sustenance. This is the kind of unremarkable eating that perfectly suits the monotone narration of a sleepy historical evening. Now, for a slightly quainter oddity, let's look at honey as medicine. Across many cultures, honey was used both in food and as a treatment. Medieval recipes sometimes instructed cooks to blend honey with wine, spices, or even meat, ostensibly for health benefits. You can picture a noble sipping this viscous mixture slowly, feeling dutifully virtuous while tasting something vaguely like sticky floral syrup and cooked chicken at the same time. It's oddly reassuring to know that people centuries ago had the same gentle mix of hope and mild regret at mealtime. Floating gently east again, bird's nest soup in imperial China deserves a mention. Made from the saliva nests of swiftlets, it was laboriously harvested, cleaned, and simmered. The resulting gelatinous dish was prized for its health-promoting properties. Imagine a dignitary slowly lifting a spoonful, contemplating its texture and efficacy, while quietly nodding to the ceremonial rhythm of the meal. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just the gentle, repetitive ritual of eating something oddly chewy because tradition and prestige demanded it. Back in Europe, let's think about offal again, but with a slightly more decorative approach. Liver, kidneys, and brains were sometimes served not just for nutrition, but for aesthetics. Medieval cooks would shape and color dishes to resemble flowers, animals, or mythical creatures. Imagine delicately chewing a small grayish morsel shaped like a rose, thinking, well, at least it looks nice. It's a reminder that presentation mattered almost as much as taste, and that eating could be an oddly meditative, slow-paced art form. Meanwhile, the daily meals of common people were reassuringly unremarkable. Pottage, bread, and seasonal vegetables dominated. Meat was rare, often reserved for festivals or market days. Grains, beans, and root vegetables were slowly simmered into nourishing, monotonous dishes. Sometimes herbs were added, occasionally a little cheese or egg, but mostly the rhythm of these meals was predictable. Cook slowly, eat slowly, digest slowly. It's almost hypnotic, really, imagining the same pot over a fire day after day. Speaking of predictable, let's gently touch on preserved foods again, which often bordered on bland survivalism. Salted meats, dried fish, and pickled vegetables were everywhere. They required meticulous preparation, careful salting, drying, or burying in cool earth to avoid spoilage. The resulting flavors were uniform, sometimes a bit chewy or pungent, but highly reliable. People ate them slowly, without excitement, appreciating their function more than their taste. And perhaps that is the most sleep-inducing thought of all. Humans across centuries quietly performing the simple, calming task of eating to live.
Now, we can meander over to drinks, because hydration has always been a gentle but essential part of human life. Ale, beer, wine, and mead were staples, often safer than water. These beverages ranged from mildly intoxicating to barely alcoholic, depending on the brewing method. Children might drink weak ale daily, while adults sipped slightly stronger versions. And because medieval sanitation wasn't exactly Michelin star standard, alcoholic beverages often doubled as disinfectant. Imagine calmly raising a wooden mug to your lips, sipping and repeating. Nothing dramatic, just slow, rhythmic survival. Moving south to Renaissance Italy, meals became an almost ceremonial practice. Elaborate multi-course dinners featured roasted meats, carefully spiced fish, vegetables, and sweets. Guests were expected to eat slowly, savoring the presentation and participating in polite conversation. Sometimes dishes incorporated unusual flavors, sweet and sour combinations, spiced fruits atop meats, or puddings enhanced with flowers. Everything was deliberate, measured, and slightly tedious, which, if you think about it, is perfect for gently lulling someone toward sleep. Even in the New World, pre-Columbian civilizations had their own peculiar dietary rhythms. Corn, beans, squash, and chili formed the bulk of daily sustenance. People would slowly grind corn into masa, bake it into bread, and simmer beans in mild stews. Occasionally, insects were consumed as protein, though mostly as a quietly accepted necessity rather than a gourmet choice. Again, the focus is on ritual, routine, and repetition rather than excitement. And before we close this part, we should consider desserts and sweets across cultures. Sugar was rare and expensive in Europe until the early modern period, so desserts were either luxury items or substitutes. Fruit preserves, honey cakes, and almond pastes were common. They required careful preparation and offered slow, measured enjoyment. Meanwhile, in Asia, rice-based sweets and subtle bean pastes provided gentle, repetitive textures and flavors, ideal for the sleepy, contemplative palate. So, as we settle here in Part 3, you can imagine all these foods quietly filling bellies across time. Mushy porridge, roasted dormice, sweetened meats, fermented shark, birds' nests, carefully molded offal, bland pottages, pickled vegetables, and the rhythmic sip of ale. Each meal a small ritual, each bite predictable, each flavor modest. The world's weird and wonderful diets, when considered slowly and without urgency, are almost hypnotic in their consistency. And that is exactly the pace we need to gently drift toward sleep.
All right, friends, let's drift a little further into the world of historical extravagance, where food wasn't just sustenance, but a slow, deliberate performance. And by performance, I mean a lot of gold leaf, baked birds, and sugar molded into unrecognizable shapes. You might want to imagine yourself comfortably tucked in under a blanket, because we're not rushing anywhere. Let's begin with royal birds. In Renaissance and Baroque Europe, it was common to serve peacocks and swans at banquets, but not just roasted or dressed in their natural feathers. Oh no, some cooks went the extra mile to replace the feathers after cooking, gild them lightly, and present the bird as if it were still alive and judging you silently from the table. Guests were expected to admire the craftsmanship, nibble delicately, and make polite conversation, all while a slightly absurdly decorated bird stared back. And yes, this is historically accurate. You can picture the scene. A monarch gently slicing meat off a shimmering peacock, nodding solemnly, while wondering if perhaps the gilded feathers might taste metallic. Meanwhile, sugar art became increasingly prominent in the late medieval and early modern courts. Wealthy Europeans, particularly in France and Italy, loved to mold sugar into tiny castles, animals, crowns, and mythical creatures. These were sometimes fully edible, sometimes purely decorative. Either way, the process was slow and meticulous, often requiring entire kitchens of assistants. And naturally, the sugar sculptures were intended to demonstrate both wealth and refinement, which, if you think about it, is essentially showing off by eating candy slowly. The repetitive, delicate nature of placing each piece, polishing it with a brush, and arranging it for presentation makes it oddly meditative. Let's glide gently over to preserved fish and meats, which were not glamorous, but were slow, essential, and everywhere. Smoked herring, salted mackerel, dried beef, and cured ham were common across Europe. These foods required attention to detail, careful salting, timing, and storage. One could easily imagine a nobleman leaning back in a chair, quietly gnawing on a piece of salted meat while a servant adjusted the table linens. The experience was repetitive, predictable, and in a sense soothing. The monotony of preservation mirrored the monotony of eating itself, and that's part of why historical meals are so comforting to drift through in narrative form. Meanwhile, in Asia, delicacies like bird's nest soup continued their slow reign. The nests, carefully harvested from cliffs, were soaked, cleaned, and simmered for hours. Patrons at court would sip the resulting gelatinous liquid slowly, savoring the texture more than the flavor. The ritual of preparation and consumption was itself a meditative act. And while we might wrinkle our noses today, the quiet patience involved in this process perfectly matches the rhythm of a sleepy storytelling session.
Now, let's gently consider exotic fruits and nuts, which often came at great cost and were treated almost as curiosities. Citrus fruits, pomegranates, and almonds were imported from distant lands, appearing at banquets in small quantities. Eating them was less about taste and more about appreciation, slicing, arranging, and slowly consuming while acknowledging their rarity. You can almost hear the quiet murmurs of awe as courtiers passed around a particularly juicy orange, nodding politely, chewing slowly, and savoring the fact that they were alive in the presence of imported fruit. Speaking of slowly, let's drift to the Victorian obsession with elaborate desserts. We've touched on blancmange before, but Victorians also adored layered puddings, molded jellies, and custards. Preparing these dishes required hours of gentle stirring, careful baking, and precise cooling, and eating them, a measured process of polite spoonfuls, tiny bites, and rhythmic tasting, all performed while seated and trying not to smudge your napkin. You can almost hear the quiet hum of calm as each dessert is consumed, one soft bite at a time. Meanwhile, commoners continued with their reliably bland, gently nourishing meals. Root vegetables, grains, legumes, and occasional meat remained the staple. Meals were slow, repetitive, and predictable, perfect for slipping gently toward rest. There's a quiet poetry in this. Centuries of people eating, chewing, swallowing, and carrying on, day after day, their rhythms echoing across time. It's soothing, really, imagining the slow cadence of life reflected in what ends up on the plate. Let's pause for a moment to think about mealtime rituals across cultures. Whether in Europe, Asia, or the New World, eating was often slow, deliberate, and punctuated with ritual gestures. Courtiers lifted utensils with care, citizens dipped morsels in sauces, and families passed bowls with gentle efficiency. There was no rush, no urgency, no need for excitement. The very repetition, the predictability, and the quiet social choreography makes it all perfectly compatible with a sleepy, calm evening. And speaking of quiet choreography, we should touch on the medieval use of spices for display rather than taste. Saffron, cinnamon, and nutmeg were not everyday items. They arrived via long, perilous trade routes and were sprinkled liberally over foods to demonstrate wealth. Often their flavors were strong, sometimes overpowering, yet diners were expected to appreciate them slowly, chewing carefully and nodding politely, while perhaps wondering if the spice might be slightly excessive. It's a delicate, rhythmic act of eating, entirely suited for bedtime reflection. In the Americas, indigenous cuisines had a similar slow rhythm. Maize, beans, squash, and chili formed the basis of meals, carefully prepared and consumed in daily cycles. Grinding maize into dough, shaping it into cakes, and slowly roasting or steaming them was meditative in its repetition. Eating was functional, nourishing, and gently predictable, another perfect rhythm for quiet evening listening. Finally, let's gently consider how people across time treated leftovers and storage. Leftovers were often reheated, stewed, or repurposed into new dishes. A week-old herring might become part of a stew, a loaf of slightly stale bread could be soaked into porridge. This too was unremarkable, repetitive, and slightly bland. And yet, it provided continuity, rhythm, and sustenance. The monotony of leftover management mirrors the monotony of life itself, and that's the kind of gentle reflection that encourages sleep. So, as Part 4 comes to a close, you can picture all these elements together: gilded birds, molded sugar, slow roasted meats, preserved fish, carefully sipped soups, rare fruits, rhythmic desserts, and the everyday routines of commoners. Every bite, every preparation, every sip is slow, measured, and deliberate. The world of historical eating is, in its own way, a perfect lullaby for the mind, letting your thoughts drift as you imagine centuries of slow, repetitive, oddly ritualistic meals.
Meanwhile, some taboos were rooted in health, or what passed for health advice at the time. People avoided combinations of foods deemed incompatible. Meat and milk together, for example, was considered dangerous in some regions, while eating certain fish during full moons was frowned upon. These rules were followed diligently, slowly shaping the rhythm of meals. Children learned them early. Adults adhered to them even when inconvenient, and no one rushed. It's a quiet choreography of diet and superstition. Let's drift gently to ritualistic eating habits among royalty. Kings and queens often had elaborate daily schedules for meals. Breakfast could be a simple broth or pottage, lunch slightly more elaborate, and dinner a multi-course spectacle. Food was often consumed in precise order, with attendants guiding every action. Sometimes, nobles would taste a morsel and quietly hold it in their mouths for a few seconds to demonstrate refinement. Others would sip wine slowly to cleanse the palate, all part of a slowly unfolding ritual that must have made ordinary peasants slightly bewildered. Meanwhile, commoners practiced their own rituals, often tied to practical needs rather than social display. In Scandinavia, for example, certain soups and stews were stirred a precise number of times, with specific herbs added at specific intervals, believed to enhance flavor, health, or luck. Repetition, rhythm, and predictability dominated. The same pot might simmer for hours, the cook occasionally stirring, occasionally tasting, and occasionally letting it rest in silence. That gentle, methodical pace is the sort of thing that encourages a sleepy mind. Moving south, in imperial China, dining etiquette and ritual were equally precise, if somewhat less dramatic. Meals often included multiple small dishes, each consumed slowly, with a focus on balance of flavors and yin-yang energies. People chewed thoughtfully, drank warm tea between bites, and occasionally offered a piece of food to a neighboring family member or servant as a sign of respect. Even if the flavors were unusual, fermented vegetables, rice wines, or soft bird nests, the experience was slow, deliberate, and almost hypnotic in its quiet repetition. Let's pause gently to consider food presentation, which was sometimes more important than the food itself. In many European courts, meat was carved in front of diners, desserts were molded into elaborate shapes, and vegetables were arranged with care. The act of eating became an unhurried performance, each bite carefully timed, each dish appreciated visually before consumption. It's calming to imagine centuries of polite chewing, nodding, and quiet observation, all designed to show sophistication without urgency. Meanwhile, everyday survival foods continued to dominate ordinary households. Root vegetables, legumes, and grains were simmered for hours. Bread was baked slowly, occasionally containing unexpected bits of bran or grain husks. Protein was often limited to small portions of salted or dried meat. These meals were bland, repetitive, and rhythmic, perfect for a bedtime story that encourages mental relaxation. Chew slowly, swallow slowly. Let the monotony of human sustenance gently lull you. Across time, people also experimented with combinations we'd now consider odd. In Renaissance Europe, it was common to mix sweet and savory, meats with fruits, or custards alongside roasts. These experiments were not always pleasant to modern taste buds, but they were carefully prepared and consumed slowly, as if following an invisible culinary metronome. The deliberate pace of eating, combined with the slightly bewildering ingredients, created a calm, almost hypnotic environment. Meanwhile, in pre-Columbian Americas, the preparation of maize and beans demanded patience and rhythm. Grinding kernels into dough, shaping them into cakes, and roasting them over fire was an act repeated daily. Stews were stirred methodically, with precise amounts of chili or herbs. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just steady, predictable, nourishing activity. And that quiet repetition, again, is the essence of historical calmness. Slow movement, slow chewing, slow satisfaction. Let's float gently toward the ceremonial side of eating. In many cultures, special foods were reserved for holidays, weddings, or religious observances. The dishes were unusual, carefully prepared, and consumed slowly, often with symbolic meaning. A festive pie might contain multiple meats and spices to represent abundance. A sweet rice dish might be served only on a particular holy day, gently reminding diners of the passage of time and the cycles of life. The meals themselves became soothing markers in the rhythm of the year. Finally, let's consider leftovers and preservation once more, because this is a quiet, enduring theme. Bread would be dried and then softened in soups. Meat might be salted, smoked, or boiled multiple times. Vegetables were pickled or buried to last through winter. Each step required care, repetition, and patience. Meals became exercises in slow mindfulness, long before mindfulness had a name. Eating, preserving, and planning for the next day formed a gentle, predictable pattern, comforting in its quiet inevitability. So as we close Part 5, you can imagine the scene across centuries and continents: nobles nibbling gilded peacocks, peasants slowly stirring pottages, families observing dietary taboos, priests arranging ceremonial feasts, and cooks repeating the same motions over and over. Each plate, each bite, each sip is a meditation in motion, a rhythmic hum that continues across time. And with that, our exploration of the weird, calm, slightly ironic history of human food begins to drift gently toward rest. All right, friends, we're drifting toward the end of our slow exploration of historical food, and now it's time to reflect quietly on what all these centuries of meals can teach us about human life. By now, you've likely imagined gruels, roasted dormice, gilded peacocks, fermented shark, sweetened meats, carefully sipped soups, and repetitive everyday routines. Let's float gently through the bigger picture. Throughout history, eating was rarely about excitement. Meals were about survival, ritual, and occasional display. Commoners ate predictably because they had no choice. Root vegetables, grains, and beans simmered slowly over fire, providing warmth and sustenance. Nobles ate extravagantly, experimenting with flavors, shapes, and rare ingredients, but still followed slow rhythms, repeated motions, and careful etiquette. Across time, food provided structure, comfort, and continuity, and in its quiet, repetitive monotony, it created the perfect backdrop for contemplation and sleep.
Consider how repetition dominates historical eating. Grinding maize, simmering pottage, stirring sauces, kneading dough, slicing meat carefully, or slowly sipping tea. These were acts repeated thousands, millions of times across generations. The monotony is hypnotic. The human mind, unhurried, can almost float alongside those who ate slowly, chewed carefully, and observed subtle rituals without urgency. There is a profound calm in imagining these ordinary, unremarkable, yet endlessly patient acts of survival and care. Even extravagances like sugar sculptures, gilded swans, and multi-course banquets followed slow, deliberate rhythms. Preparing the dishes required hours or days. Consuming them required quiet attention, and every bite was measured. In a way, the seemingly bizarre or luxurious foods share the same gentle pacing as everyday meals. The difference is only in complexity, not in tempo, and that in itself is soothing. Then there's the matter of food as comfort. People have always turned to familiar meals for reassurance. A bowl of gruel, a slowly roasted chicken, a well-preserved herring. These are not exciting, but they are reliable. Across centuries, the act of eating has remained one of the few constants. Chew, swallow, digest, repeat. The predictability is comforting, meditative, and a gentle reminder of continuity in a chaotic world. Let's float for a moment through ritual and superstition,
because this too added calmness to life. People adhered to dietary taboos, prepared meals according to the calendar, observed ceremonial eating, and respected cultural norms. These rules imposed structure and rhythm, which in turn created mental space for quiet observation. Imagine a medieval cook stirring a pot for hours, a courtier lifting a spoon with careful precision, a child learning to eat in silence while watching elders, a slow shared dance across time. In the end, what connects all these historical meals, from the humble porridge to exotic delicacies, is the gentle, methodical nature of consumption. Every act, from preparation to swallowing, was performed at a deliberate pace. The flavors, textures, and ingredients vary, but the rhythm remains constant. And that is why thinking about historical diets, especially the odd, obscure, or slightly bizarre ones, is so effective as a sleep aid. There is no urgency, no drama, just steady, predictable human behavior across the ages. So, as we slowly conclude tonight's journey through the weird, wonderful, and sometimes slightly unpleasant foods of history, let's carry one last thought. Humanity has always found comfort in routine, even in the simple act of eating. Whether it was a Viking chewing fermented shark, a medieval peasant stirring pottage, a French noble slicing a gilded swan, or a Chinese dignitary sipping bird's nest soup, each person moved at a calm, deliberate pace. Their meals, repetitive and ritualistic, were a quiet affirmation of life itself. And now, as you lay back and imagine centuries of gentle, slow-paced meals, let the rhythm of history mingle with your own breathing. Chew slowly, swallow, breathe, relax. Think of distant kitchens, silent dining halls, and countless humans quietly repeating the same motions. Feel the slow cadence of meals passed, and let it carry you gently into sleep. Good night, friends. May your dreams be as calm, rhythmic, and oddly satisfying as a perfectly simmered pottage.